Power didn't begin in parliaments or palaces. It began in back alleys, betting shops, illegal distilleries, and smoke-filled rooms where men with no titles rewrote the rules of nations. Before governments controlled streets, street gangs controlled governments. The Peaky Blinders were not just a Birmingham gang with razors in their caps. They were an early warning sign of something bigger, a shadow economy so powerful it bent laws, corrupted institutions, and quietly shaped modern states. The twist is this: while history remembers kings and prime ministers, the real architects of control often wore suits only when the streets became too valuable to rule from the shadows. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain was the center of global power. Its empire stretched across continents, its factories fed the world, and its banks financed nations. But beneath that image of order, the streets told a different story. Industrial cities like Birmingham, Manchester, and London were exploding with population. Workers poured in faster than governments could manage housing, policing, or welfare. Poverty, alcohol, and desperation created a vacuum, and gangs rushed in to fill it. They didn't just sell violence, they sold protection, jobs, credit, and certainty. In neighborhoods abandoned by the state, gangs became the state. The Peaky Blinders emerged from this chaos. They were young, aggressive, and disciplined. Unlike older street thugs, they understood organization. Territory mattered, reputation mattered, control mattered. They enforced their own rules, punished betrayal instantly, and rewarded loyalty generously. Money flowed through gambling, horse racing, extortion, and illegal liquor. Every coin bought influence. Shopkeepers paid not just to avoid violence, but to gain access to markets, to protection, to opportunity. This was not random crime, it was structured power. What made gangs like the Peaky Blinders dangerous was not brutality alone, it was ambition. They didn't want to exist outside the system, they wanted to sit inside it. They bribed police officers, intimidated judges, and funded local politicians. Elections were decided not by speeches, but by who controlled the streets on voting day. Ballot boxes disappeared, voters were threatened, outcomes were managed. Democracy existed on paper, while power operated elsewhere. This is where the story widens beyond Birmingham. Similar gangs were rising across Europe and America. In Chicago, New York, and Naples, street organizations followed the same pattern. First, control territory. Second, monopolize illegal markets. Third, convert criminal profits into political influence. The uniforms changed, the accents changed, the strategy stayed the same. Where governments failed to provide stability, gangs became the managers of chaos. The Peaky Blinders understood something early that governments learned much later. Legitimacy, docency, come from law alone. It comes from results. If a gang could deliver safety, income, and order faster than the state, people accepted them and depended on them. This dependency was the real power. Violence enforced fear, but money enforced loyalty, and loyalty scaled. As World War I approached, this underground power network became even more valuable. Governments needed workers, soldiers, and stability. Gangs controlled manpower, unions, transport routes, and black markets. Suddenly, criminals were assets. Deals were made quietly, raids stopped, sentences softened. In exchange, gangs delivered order when the state could not afford disorder. The line between criminal and collaborator blurred. Within the first minute of this story, one thing becomes clear. If you want to understand how gangs took over nations, you must stop thinking of them as outsiders. They were early competitors to the state itself. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, subscribe to Fiscora Empire now. This channel exists to uncover the systems beneath the headlines, the real mechanics of power that textbooks leave out. But the rise of gangs like the Peaky Blinders was not inevitable. It followed a clear cause and effect chain. Industrial capitalism created massive wealth at the top and brutal instability at the bottom. Governments prioritized expansion over social control. Police forces were underfunded, courts overwhelmed, and laws outdated. Into this gap stepped organized street power. They adapted faster than institutions. They innovated while governments reacted. The Peaky Blinders refined their model. They moved from street fights to structured rackets, from local gambling to regional networks, from cash-only deals to laundering money through legitimate businesses. Pubs, factories, and betting houses became fronts. On paper, everything looked legal. In practice, it was gang capital at work. This was the moment street gangs stopped being temporary threats and became permanent forces. Yet with growth came pressure. Rival gangs challenged territory. The state slowly reorganized. Media exposure increased, and war loomed a force that would reshape everything. The very system that allowed gangs to rise was about to demand their loyalty, their manpower, and their silence. Some gangs would evolve, others would collapse. A few would embed themselves so deeply that removing them would take generations. This is where the real tension begins. Because once gangs taste political power, they don't give it up willingly. They don't disappear when laws tighten. They adapt, they professionalize, they enter boardrooms. The Peaky Blinders were not the end of street power. They were the prototype. In the next part, we'll follow how these gangs scaled beyond streets into institutions, how war accelerated their rise, and how the breaking point forced governments to confront monsters they had quietly empowered. What started with razors and alleyways would soon challenge the authority of nations themselves. War did not destroy the gangs, it transformed them. When World War I erupted, governments across Europe faced a problem no official plan had prepared for. Millions of men were sent to the front. Factories shifted to wartime production. Food, fuel, and labor became scarce overnight. Law enforcement weakened as officers enlisted or were reassigned. Black markets exploded, and once again, the groups best positioned to adapt were not governments, but gangs. For organizations like the Peaky Blinders, the war was an accelerant. They already controlled betting rings, transport routes, and networks of loyalty built on fear and reward. Now those same networks became essential to wartime survival. Illegal alcohol filled the gap when rationing tightened. Smuggled goods replaced broken supply chains. Forged documents, stolen uniforms, and diverted resources flowed through underground channels. What had once been criminal profit now became strategic value. Governments noticed, quietly, reluctantly, they began to tolerate what they could not fully control. Raids slowed, arrests dropped. Certain names were ignored. The gangs, in return, kept the streets calm, crushed rival groups, and ensured labor stayed productive. This was not a written agreement, but an understood exchange. Stability in wartime mattered more than legality. The state needed order, and gangs delivered it faster than bureaucracy ever could. As soldiers returned from the front, they came back to cities changed by violence and scarcity. Many found no jobs, no support, and no place in the economy they had fought to defend. Gangs absorbed them. Veterans brought discipline, weapons, knowledge, and emotional numbness to brutality. The gangs became more organized, more militarized, and more ruthless. This was no longer teenage street crime. It was paramilitary economics. The Peaky Blinders expanded their reach beyond Birmingham. Gambling operations linked cities. Horse racing became a national enterprise controlled through intimidation and bribery. Money moved across regions, not pockets. With scale came structure. Hierarchies formed. Leaders wore tailored suits. Decisions were made in offices, not alleys. Violence became a tool, not a habit. Used carefully, publicly denied, privately enforced. This was the rise phase, the moment. Street gangs crossed into something more dangerous. They learned that real power was not about fighting the state head-on, but feeding off it. They mirrored government functions. They taxed businesses through protection money. They enforced contracts through fear. They resolved disputes faster than courts. In many working-class neighborhoods, gang justice felt more immediate and reliable than official law. But every system built on fear carries a breaking point. As gang wealth increased, so did visibility. Newspapers began connecting dots. Politicians realized elections were being manipulated. Legitimate businesses complained about extortion. Insurance companies tracked suspicious patterns. And perhaps most importantly, governments emerged from the war with a new lesson. Uncontrolled street power was a national security risk. The state responded the only way it could by professionalizing. Police forces were centralized. Intelligence units were created. Laws expanded. Surveillance increased. What gangs once exploited slow bureaucracy was slowly closing in on them. The informal arrangements that protected gangs during the war became liabilities in peace. Allies turned cautious. Politicians distanced themselves. Silence replaced cooperation. For gangs like the Peaky Blinders, this was the breaking point. They faced a choice: evolve again, or be crushed. Some doubled down on violence, escalating conflicts with rivals and authorities. Others tried to launder their power into legitimacy, investing in businesses, influencing unions, entering politics openly. A few succeeded, many failed. The state, now more confident, made examples: high-profile arrests, public trials, heavy sentences. The message was clear: street power would no longer be tolerated unless it could be fully absorbed or neutralized. What once felt unstoppable began to fracture. Internal betrayals followed. Loyalty weakened when fear was no longer enough. Yet even in decline, the gangs left a permanent mark. They had proven something dangerous: that organized groups could rival the state if given economic space and social neglect. They showed how quickly informal power structures could become parallel governments, and they revealed how easily legality bends when stability is at risk. The Peaky Blinders did not fall because crime failed. They fell because the state learned from them. It adopted their efficiency, their intelligence networks, their ruthless prioritization of control. The tools changed hands. The logic stayed the same. In the final part, we'll examine what happened after the crackdown, how gang logic moved into corporations and politics, and why modern nations still operate on systems first perfected in the streets. Because while the Peaky Blinders faded from headlines, the model they built never truly disappeared. The crackdown did not erase street power, it refined it. When gangs like the Peaky Blinders were pushed out of the streets, their methods didn't vanish. They migrated. Violence gave way to contracts. Extortion evolved into lobbying. Gambling rings became licensed betting firms. What had once been illegal markets were legalized, regulated, and quietly absorbed into the formal economy. The winners were not the men with razors in their caps, but those who understood how to translate raw street control into respectable influence. Many former gang leaders disappeared from public view, not because they lost power, but because they changed its shape. Money was laundered through property, factories, and entertainment businesses. Political donations replaced bribes. Legal teams replaced enforcers. The goal remained the same: control outcomes without visible force. The modern corporation borrowed heavily from the gang playbook hierarchies: loyalty, rewards, non-disclosure, and the quiet elimination of threats through economic pressure rather than fists. This is where the story connects directly to today. Look at any modern economy and you'll see echoes of street logic everywhere. Market dominance matters more than fairness. Barriers to entry protect those already inside. Influence flows through money, access, and silence. The tactics that once controlled neighborhoods now shape industries. The Peaky Blinders were not an anomaly. They were an early version of organized power, adapting faster than law. Modern governments still face the same dilemma their predecessors did. Stability often matters more than justice. When institutions fail to deliver opportunity, alternative power structures emerge. Sometimes they wear hoodies and run digital scams. Sometimes they wear suits and write legislation. The appearance changes, the function remains. Control resources, control narratives, control outcomes. The final lesson of the Peaky Blinders is not about crime. It's about systems. Street gangs rose because the state left gaps. They grew because those gaps were profitable. They declined only when the state copied their efficiency and reclaimed control. And even then, it absorbed more than it destroyed. Power rarely disappears. It relocates. 3 takeaways matter here. First, power always fills a vacuum. When governments fail to provide security, income, or fairness, something else will. Second, legality is flexible under pressure. What is illegal today can become essential tomorrow if stability is at risk. Third, the most dangerous forms of power are the ones that stop looking dangerous. When control becomes normalized, it stops being questioned. The warning is simple but uncomfortable. If modern societies ignore inequality, instability, and institutional weakness, new forms of organized power will rise quieter, smarter, and harder to confront. They may not carry blades, they may carry contracts. And by the time they are noticed, they may already be embedded too deeply to remove. If this documentary changed how you see history and modern power, subscribe to Fiscora Empire for more stories that expose the systems behind influence and control. Drop a comment with your thoughts on whether today's corporations and political machines are any different from the gangs of the past. Share this video with someone who still believes power only comes from official titles. Because once you understand how the streets shaped nations, you'll never look at authority the same way again.